Most people remember the moment their lives changed. Very few remember that it started with something as small as a glass of milk. The rain had been falling for nearly 3 hours when Aaliyah Johnson stopped in front of the iron gates. Water dripped from the edges of her worn gray hoodie, tracing cold lines down her sleeves before disappearing into fingers stiff from the weather. The mansion beyond the gates stretched across the hill like something from another world, its warm golden windows glowing against the dark afternoon sky. From where she stood, she could see soft lights reflecting off polished stone, the kind of home people drove past just to admire. Aaliyah tightened her grip on the strap of her faded backpack. It was nearly empty now. So was her stomach. She had walked more than 6 miles that day through neighborhoods that seemed to grow wealthier with every block. At first, she had knocked on doors offering to rake leaves, carry groceries, wash windows, anything that might earn a few dollars. Most people never answered. Some glanced through curtains and pretended not to see her. Others offered polite smiles before closing the door. By late afternoon, the cold had settled deep into her bones. The last thing she wanted was to ask anyone for help. Her mother had always taught her that dignity mattered, especially when life became difficult. But dignity didn't stop hunger. And right now, hunger felt heavier than pride. She climbed the stone path toward the front door, each step carrying a quiet hesitation. The house seemed larger the closer she came, its tall columns rising above her like silent guardians. For a moment, she considered turning around. Maybe she could make it another mile. Maybe she could find work somewhere else. Maybe tomorrow would be better. But then a sharp ache twisted through her stomach, reminding her that hope alone wasn't enough. Taking a slow breath, she reached for the brass doorbell. The sound echoed faintly inside. Seconds passed, then a minute. Rain tapped softly against the roof overhang above her. Finally, the door opened. A woman in a dark uniform appeared. Her expression shifted almost immediately when she saw Aaliyah. Standing there, her eyes moved over the soaked hoodie, the worn sneakers, the backpack hanging from one shoulder. The assessment took less than 2 seconds. It always did. "Can I help you?" the woman asked, her tone careful but distant. Aaliyah swallowed. Her throat felt dry despite the rain. She lowered her gaze briefly before meeting the woman's eyes again. "Ma'am," she said softly, her voice steady despite the cold. "I'm only asking for a glass of milk." The words hung in the air between them. No dramatic plea, no long explanation, just a simple request. The woman blinked, surprised by the answer. Before she could respond, another voice emerged from deeper inside the house. Calm, older, controlled. "Who is it?" Footsteps approached across polished marble floors. A moment later, a tall man appeared behind the housekeeper. His silver hair caught the warm light from the foyer chandelier. His tailored suit looked as if it belonged in a magazine. Everything about him suggested power, wealth, and a life far removed from the rain outside. William Harrison stopped when he saw the young girl standing on his doorstep. For a brief second, neither of them spoke. The billionaire studied her carefully, noticing the water dripping from her sleeves, the exhaustion hidden behind determined eyes, and the way she stood with quiet dignity despite having almost nothing. Then his gaze settled on her face. And somewhere beneath the sound of falling rain and the glow of mansion lights, something shifted, though neither of them knew it yet. Because the girl asking for a glass of milk had just arrived at the door that would change her life forever. Aaliyah expected the door to close. That was usually how these moments ended. A polite refusal if she was lucky, silence if she was not. Instead, William Harrison remained standing in the foyer, studying her with an expression she could not quite understand. The rain continued falling behind her while warm air drifted from inside the mansion, carrying the faint scent of fresh bread and something sweet she could not identify. Her stomach tightened immediately. She hated that it did. Hunger had a way of exposing every weakness a person tried to hide. The housekeeper glanced toward William, waiting for instructions. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then William stepped slightly forward. "How old are you?" he asked. 15, sir," Aaliyah replied. His eyes narrowed, not in suspicion but in thought. "And you walked here alone?" She nodded. "Yes, sir." The billionaire looked beyond her toward the empty road disappearing into the rain. The nearest neighborhood was miles away. Most people would have driven that distance without a second thought. A 15-year-old girl had crossed it on foot. Something about that fact lingered in his mind. The housekeeper finally broke the silence. Sir, should I close the door? William did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked back at Aaliyah. Even soaked from head to toe, she stood with quiet composure. She was not begging. She was not demanding anything. She was simply waiting. What is your name? He asked. Aaliyah Johnson. And why exactly are you out here in weather like this? For a moment she hesitated. Her mother always said strangers did not need to know every hardship. Some struggles were meant to be carried with dignity. I was looking for work, she answered carefully. Any kind of work. William glanced at her backpack. After school, a small shadow crossed her face. I have not been able to attend much lately. The answer hung in the air. She offered nothing more. No excuses. No dramatic explanation. William noticed that too. Most people volunteered details when they wanted sympathy. This girl seemed determined to protect her pride, even when circumstances gave her every reason not to. Finally, he turned toward the housekeeper. Bring her inside. The woman blinked. Sir, she is freezing. Aaliyah immediately shook her head. I do not want to cause trouble. A glass of milk is enough. The response surprised both adults. William had spent decades around people who wanted more. More money. More opportunities. More attention. Yet this young girl seemed uncomfortable accepting even basic kindness. Come inside, he said gently. That is not a request. Aaliyah stepped across the threshold. Warmth wrapped around her instantly. The sensation almost made her dizzy. Her wet shoes touched polished marble floors that reflected the soft chandelier light overhead. Everything felt impossibly distant from the apartment she shared with her mother. Their building had peeling paint, unreliable heat, and windows that rattled whenever strong winds arrived. This place felt like another world. A few minutes later, the housekeeper returned carrying a tall glass of cold milk. Tiny drops of condensation slid down the side of the glass. Aaliyah stared at it for a second before accepting it with both hands. Thank you, ma'am. She took a careful sip. Then another. The cold sweetness spread through her body, easing an exhaustion she had been carrying for days. William watched quietly from across the room. Most people would never understand how much gratitude could exist inside something so simple. But as he observed the relief in her eyes, a strange feeling stirred somewhere deep within him, like the first movement of a memory that had been sleeping for years. William Harrison had built an empire by trusting facts more than appearances. Over 4 decades in business, he had learned that the most dangerous mistakes often came from making assumptions too quickly. Yet as he watched Aaliyah sitting quietly near the fireplace, holding the nearly empty glass with both hands as though it were something valuable, he found himself questioning instincts he had relied on for years. Most visitors who crossed the threshold of his home arrived with agendas. Investors wanted opportunities. Politicians wanted influence. Reporters wanted stories. Even charitable organizations usually arrived with prepared speeches and carefully calculated requests. But this young girl had asked for one thing, and one thing only. A glass of milk. Nothing more. The simplicity of it felt strangely rare. William settled into a chair across from her. The flames from the fireplace cast soft reflections across the room, pushing back the gray shadows of the storm outside. You said you were looking for work, he began. What kind of work? Aaliyah set the glass carefully on a small table before answering. Any honest work, sir. The response came immediately, without hesitation. William noticed that. What does that mean exactly? She thought for a moment. Yard work. Cleaning. Carrying groceries. Helping people move things. Whatever someone needs. William nodded slowly. And how much were you hoping to earn? Enough. The answer almost made him smile. Enough for what? For the first time, Aaliyah looked away. Her eyes drifted toward the rain-covered windows. Bills. William waited. She did not continue. Again, he noticed what she chose not to say. Many people exaggerated their problems when speaking to someone wealthy. This girl seemed determined to reveal as little as possible. Do you live nearby? He asked. About 6 miles away. The distance surprised him. Walking that far in good weather was difficult. Walking it during a cold storm was something else entirely. Your parents know you are out here? A flicker of emotion crossed her face. My mother does. William heard the careful wording immediately. Not my parents. My mother. Another detail. Another piece of a puzzle he did not yet understand. The housekeeper entered carrying a small tray with warm dinner rolls. She placed them on the table between them before leaving again. Aaliyah glanced at the food but made no move toward it. William leaned back slightly. You can have one. Thank you, sir. She took a single roll. Not two. Not three. One. Then she broke it in half and slipped part of it into her backpack. William raised an eyebrow. Saving it. Aaliyah looked embarrassed. For my mother. The room grew quiet. Outside, rain tapped gently against the glass. Inside, something shifted again in William's understanding of the girl sitting before him. She had walked miles in the cold. She had arrived hungry. Yet even now she was thinking about someone else first. He studied her face carefully, not because he doubted her story, but because he was beginning to suspect there was far more to it than she was willing to reveal. And for the first time that afternoon, William Harrison decided he wanted to know the truth. William remained silent for several moments after Aaliyah finished speaking. The crackling fireplace filled the room with a gentle rhythm while rain continued sliding down the tall windows overlooking the darkening hillside. He had intended to ask a few questions and then send her home with a meal. That would have been the reasonable thing to do. It was what most people expected from a charitable gesture. But something about the young girl sitting across from him refused to fit neatly into any category he understood. She carried herself with the quiet discipline of someone much older than 15. Every answer was respectful. Every word was measured. Most striking of all, she seemed determined not to ask for anything beyond what she truly needed. William reached into his jacket pocket and removed his wallet. Inside were several crisp bills. He pulled out a $100 note and placed it gently on the coffee table between them. The green paper looked almost out of place against the polished wood. Take it, he said. You can buy groceries. Help your mother. Get out of the rain. Aaliyah looked at the bill. Then she looked at William. For a brief moment, neither spoke. The amount of money could have solved several immediate problems. It could have filled their refrigerator. It could have paid utility bills. It could have bought medication. Yet instead of reaching for it, she lowered her eyes. Thank you, sir, she said softly. But I cannot take that. William blinked. He was not accustomed to hearing those words. In boardrooms, people negotiated aggressively for far less. Entire careers had been built around obtaining resources. Yet here was a teenager refusing help most adults would accept without hesitation. Why not? He asked. Aaliyah folded her hands together. Because I did not earn it. William leaned forward slightly. You needed a glass of milk. Yes, sir. And you need food. Yes, sir. Then why refuse something that could help? She thought carefully before answering. My mother taught me that there is a difference between kindness and dependency. I asked for milk because I was hungry. I cannot ask someone else to carry my responsibilities. The words landed with unexpected force. William felt himself studying her all over again. There was no arrogance in her voice. No judgment. Only conviction. The kind that comes from values practiced repeatedly until they become part of a person's character. You walked 6 miles in a storm looking for work, William said. That sounds like earning something to me. Aaliyah offered a small smile. Then maybe one day I can earn $100. But not today. The room grew quiet again. Even the housekeeper standing near the doorway appeared surprised. She had witnessed countless guests pass through the mansion over the years. She had seen people flatter William, persuade him, and occasionally manipulate him. She had never seen someone refuse him so politely. William slowly returned the bill to his wallet. For reasons he could not fully explain, he felt more impressed than offended. Outside, the rain had begun to soften. The storm was losing strength. Inside, however, a different realization was beginning to form. William Harrison had spent years measuring people by achievements, resumes, and financial success. Yet sitting across from him was a young girl with almost nothing to her name except integrity. And somehow, that seemed far more valuable than any number written on a balance sheet. The grandfather clock near the staircase chimed softly, marking another hour lost to the storm outside. Aaliyah glanced toward the tall windows. The rain had eased, but darkness was beginning to settle across the hills. She knew her mother would be worried. Every minute away from home felt heavier than the last. Slowly, she rose from her chair and picked up her backpack. Thank you for the milk, sir, she said. And thank you for letting me come inside. William looked up. You are leaving already? I should get home before it gets too late. Before he could answer, another voice entered the room. A man in a dark suit stepped through a side doorway carrying a tablet. He appeared to be in his early 50s, with sharp features and the rigid posture of someone who valued order above all else. His name was Charles Whitmore, William's estate manager. Charles immediately noticed Aaliyah, standing near the fireplace. His eyes moved from her backpack to her wet shoes, and then back to William. "Sir," he said carefully, "may I speak with you for a moment?" William nodded. Charles approached, lowering his voice, though not enough to prevent Aaliyah from hearing parts of the conversation. "We should be careful," he said. "People sometimes invent stories to gain sympathy." William's expression remained neutral. "And what story has she invented?" Charles glanced toward Aaliyah again. "I do not know. That is the point." The words settled heavily in the room. Aaliyah lowered her gaze. She had heard similar assumptions before. Sometimes people looked at her clothes and decided who she was before she ever spoke. Sometimes they saw her skin color, her neighborhood, or the fact that she came from very little and built an entire story around those details. The painful part was not the judgment itself. It was how ordinary it had become. Charles continued, "You have responsibilities, sir. You cannot invite every stranger into your home." William remained silent. Meanwhile, the housekeeper stepped closer to the coffee table and noticed something partially visible inside Aaliyah's backpack. "What is that?" she asked suddenly. Aaliyah looked confused. The housekeeper reached toward the open zipper and carefully pulled out a silver fountain pen. For a brief second, the room became completely still. The pen belonged to William. It had been resting on his desk earlier that afternoon. Charles immediately frowned. "How did that get there?" Aaliyah stared at the pen in shock. "I do not know." Charles folded his arms. "It did not walk into your bag by itself." Heat rushed into Aaliyah's face. "I did not take it." Her voice remained calm, but her heart was racing. She had spent her entire life protecting her dignity. Now, within seconds, suspicion had erased all of it. Charles shook his head. "That is difficult to believe." Aaliyah could feel every eye in the room on her. Yet despite the embarrassment burning inside her chest, she refused to argue or raise her voice. She simply stood there, holding her backpack strap. "I understand why you think that," she said quietly. "But I know I did not take anything." The room fell silent again. William looked from the pen to Aaliyah and then back to Charles. What happened next would reveal far more about everyone in the room than the missing pen ever could. No one moved. The silver fountain pen rested in the housekeeper's hand, catching the glow of the chandelier as silence settled across the room. Outside, the storm had nearly passed. Only a few drops of rain remained, sliding slowly down the tall glass windows like fading traces of something heavier. William looked at Aaliyah. She stood exactly where she had been moments earlier. Her shoulders were tense, but her expression remained calm. There was hurt in her eyes, certainly, but not anger, not resentment. Just the quiet sadness of someone who had encountered this kind of judgment before. Charles seemed convinced he already understood the situation. The housekeeper looked uncertain. Yet Aaliyah offered no defense beyond the simple truth she had already spoken. "I did not take it." Nothing more. No dramatic protest. No desperate attempt to persuade anyone. Just those 5 words. William slowly rose from his chair and walked toward the large windows overlooking the dark hillside. His reflection appeared faintly in the glass. Older now. Grayer. More tired than he often admitted to himself. Behind him, the room waited. But for a moment, he was no longer seeing the mansion. He was seeing another night. Another storm. Another lifetime. He remembered being 13 years old, standing outside a small grocery store in Ohio. His father had recently lost his job. Their refrigerator had been nearly empty for days. William still remembered the embarrassment he felt when the store owner caught him staring through the front window at the shelves of food. He had expected suspicion. He had expected judgment. Instead, an elderly woman had stepped outside carrying a paper bag. She never asked questions, never demanded explanations. She simply handed him a loaf of bread and said, "Sometimes people need kindness more than proof." William had never forgotten those words. Yet somewhere along the road to success, surrounded by contracts, negotiations, and endless calculations, he had stopped living by them. The memory lingered as softly as the rain outside. Sometimes people need kindness. More than proof. He closed his eyes briefly. Then another realization surfaced. During the entire conversation, Aaliyah had never once asked for sympathy. She had never exaggerated her hardship. She had refused money she desperately needed. She had saved half a dinner roll for her mother. None of those actions matched the picture Charles seemed eager to believe. William turned back toward the room. His gaze settled on Aaliyah once again. She looked exhausted, hungry, embarrassed. but there was still dignity in the way she stood. A dignity that suspicion had not managed to take away. The fire crackled quietly nearby. Shadows danced across the walls. The house that usually felt so large suddenly seemed strangely small compared to the weight of the moment unfolding inside it. William looked at the fountain pen, then at the girl, then at Charles. No anger entered his expression. No confrontation. Only certainty. For the first time that evening, he understood that this situation was no longer about a missing object. It was about something far more important. It was about the difference between seeing a person and seeing an assumption. And as the final traces of rain faded beyond the windows, William Harrison found himself wondering whether the greatest test in the room had never belonged to Aaliyah at all. William walked calmly across the room and extended his hand toward the housekeeper. "May I see the pen?" he asked. She immediately placed it in his palm. The silver fountain pen felt familiar. It had accompanied him through contract signings, board meetings, and countless decisions that shaped his company. Yet as he examined it more closely, something caught his attention. A small drop of moisture rested near the cap. Not rainwater. The pen had been dry when he used it earlier that afternoon. William slowly turned toward the grand staircase. Then he noticed something else. On the polished marble floor near the hallway entrance lay a folded cleaning cloth. One of the housekeeping staff had been dusting the study only minutes before Aaliyah arrived. A memory clicked into place. Earlier that day, he had left the pen on his desk while reviewing documents. The study door had remained open. Several employees had passed through the room afterward. Charles watched impatiently. "Sir, regardless of how it got there, the pen was found inside her backpack." William met his gaze. "Was it?" Charles frowned. "That is what we all saw." William nodded thoughtfully before looking toward the housekeeper. "Did you see her place it there?" "No, sir." "Did anyone see her enter my study?" "No, sir." Charles shifted uncomfortably. William continued. "Then what we saw was a pen inside a partially open backpack. We did not see how it arrived there." The room became silent again. For the first time, uncertainty replaced confidence on Charles's face. William walked toward Aaliyah. She stood quietly, saying nothing. The young girl had been accused, judged, examined, yet she had not responded with bitterness. Even now, there was no anger in her eyes, only fatigue. William glanced at the backpack. A realization formed. Earlier, when the housekeeper had brought the tray of dinner rolls, she had placed it near the table where Aaliyah's backpack rested open beside the chair. Staff members had moved through the room several times afterward. The pen could easily have been set down accidentally by anyone passing nearby. The explanation was simple, perhaps too simple. Yet it was far more believable than the idea that a girl who refused $100 would steal a pen she could never realistically use or sell. William carefully placed the fountain pen into his own pocket. "I believe her." Charles looked surprised. "Sir, no." William's voice remained calm but firm. "I believe her." The estate manager fell silent. Aaliyah lowered her eyes, relief mixing with embarrassment. But William was not finished. Something still troubled him. The deeper question was not how the pen entered the backpack. The deeper question was why everyone had been so willing to assume the worst. As the realization settled over him, he found himself looking at Aaliyah differently than before. Not as a stranger standing in his mansion, not as a charity case, but as someone carrying a burden far heavier than poverty. The burden of constantly having to prove she deserved trust. Then, another thought surfaced. What if everything she had said was true? What if a 15-year-old girl really had walked 6 miles through a storm searching for work because her family needed help? William suddenly wanted answers. Not because he doubted her anymore, because he believed her. And the truth behind her story felt far more important than the misunderstanding that had just unfolded. By the time Aaliyah finally stepped toward the front door, the storm outside had ended completely. But neither of them knew that the most important part of their story was only beginning. 8 years passed. Seasons came and went across the city. Buildings rose and disappeared behind new construction, and thousands of lives changed in ways nobody could predict. Yet some moments refused to fade. William Harrison still remembered the rain-soaked evening when a hungry 15-year-old girl had stood at his front door asking for nothing more than a glass of milk. In the years that followed, he quietly learned the truth about her circumstances. He discovered that her mother, Denise Johnson, had been battling a serious illness while working every hour she could manage. He learned that Aaliyah had been missing school not because she lacked ambition, but because she was helping care for her family. Most importantly, he learned that everything she had told him that night had been true. Without ever making a public announcement or expecting recognition, William arranged assistance through trusted charitable programs. Medical care became available for Denise. Educational opportunities opened for Aaliyah. Scholarships appeared where there had once been closed doors. He never presented himself as a hero. He simply removed obstacles and allowed determination to do the rest. Aaliyah never forgot that. She worked harder than anyone around her. While other students spent weekends relaxing, she studied. While others complained about difficult classes, she stayed after hours in libraries reviewing material until the lights dimmed. Year after year, her dedication carried her forward. Eventually, she earned admission to medical school, then residency, then a position at one of the most respected hospitals in the state. Through every milestone, she carried the same values her mother had taught her: gratitude, integrity, compassion. One autumn morning, nearly a decade after the storm, William found himself sitting in a hospital examination room. Time had touched him in ways money could not prevent. His hair had become entirely silver. His movements were slower. A routine health concern had brought him to the hospital for additional testing. Nothing urgent, nothing dramatic. Yet sitting alone in the quiet room reminded him that even billionaires eventually become patients. The door opened softly. William looked up from the paperwork resting in his lap. A physician entered wearing a white coat with a name embroidered above the pocket. For a second, he only noticed the confidence in her posture. Then his eyes moved to the name: Dr. Aaliyah Johnson. The room became completely still. Aaliyah paused as recognition appeared on both faces simultaneously. The years had changed them, but not enough to erase the memory. William slowly stood. He could hardly believe what he was seeing. The shy girl who had once walked 6 miles through a storm was now standing before him as a physician. Aaliyah smiled warmly. There was no trace of resentment from the misunderstanding years earlier. No bitterness, only genuine kindness. "Good morning, Mr. Harrison," she said gently. "It is good to see you again." For the first time in many years, William felt speechless. He had helped open a door. She had walked through it herself. And standing there in that white coat, she represented something far greater than success. She represented the extraordinary power of a single act of kindness to echo across an entire lifetime. The examination went well. The test results were reassuring, and by late afternoon, William was preparing to leave the hospital. Yet something kept him from walking out immediately. As he gathered his belongings, his eyes drifted once more toward the office where Dr. Aaliyah Johnson was finishing paperwork. Through the glass wall, he could see her speaking with a patient, offering the same calm attention she had shown everyone throughout the day. There was no sign of hurry, no sign of impatience, only kindness. The kind that could not be taught in medical school, the kind that came from experience. Several minutes later, Aaliyah stepped into the hallway. "Everything looks good, Mr. Harrison," she said with a warm smile. "You should be able to head home." William nodded. "Thank you, doctor." The title still felt remarkable to say aloud. Aaliyah smiled again. "You are very welcome." For a moment, neither moved. Years of memories stood quietly between them. Finally, William spoke. "I never properly thanked you." Aaliyah looked surprised. "For what?" William glanced toward the large hospital windows where the setting sun was painting the sky in soft shades of gold and orange. "For reminding me who I wanted to be." A gentle silence followed. Aaliyah understood immediately. She remembered the night of the storm, the misunderstanding, the kindness that followed, the opportunities that had changed the direction of her life. But she also understood something else. People often focused on what William had done for her. Few realized that his willingness to trust, to listen, and to see beyond assumptions had changed him as well. Before she could answer, a nurse approached carrying a folder. "Dr. Johnson, the billing office asked me to give this to your patient before discharge." The nurse handed the document to William and continued down the hallway. William glanced at the folder absent-mindedly. Hospital bills were never pleasant reading, even for someone of his means. He opened it and scanned the pages. Then he stopped. His eyes narrowed slightly. At the bottom of the final page was a handwritten note. He read it once, then again. The amount due showed $0. Beneath it, written in neat blue ink, was a single sentence. "Paid in full many years ago with 1 glass of milk." William stared at the page. The busy sounds of the hospital seemed to fade into the distance. He looked up slowly. Aaliyah stood quietly across from him. There was no dramatic speech, no expectation of praise, only a gentle smile and eyes filled with gratitude rather than obligation. For several seconds, neither spoke. None of the numbers that had defined William's career seemed important anymore. Not stock prices, not investments, not company valuations. In that moment, the only thing that mattered was the simple truth resting on a sheet of paper. Kindness had traveled across years, through hardship, opportunity, and success, only to return to the place where it began. The evening sunlight poured through the windows, surrounding the hallway with warmth. Nurses continued their rounds. Patients greeted loved ones. Life moved forward as it always did. William carefully folded the paper and placed it inside his jacket pocket. Then he looked at Aaliyah one last time. No words were necessary. Some moments speak more clearly through silence. As he walked slowly toward the exit, the golden light followed him across the floor. Behind him stood a doctor whose life had been changed by compassion. Ahead of him stretched a world still filled with people who needed it. And somewhere between those two realities remained the quiet echo of a simple act of kindness, proving that the smallest gift can sometimes leave the longest legacy.